For 2 full months, every single day, at exactly 4 o'clock in the afternoon, a 5-year-old girl with brown curls would slip out of the cleaning supply closet on the 2nd floor of the nursing home, clutching a small wax paper bag tight against her chest. Inside there was only one thing: an oatmeal raisin cookie her mother baked every night with hands cracked open by chemicals. That cookie wasn't for the little girl. It was for an old man no one in the whole facility wanted to step in to see. They called him Walt the Wall, the crankiest, the loudest, the loneliest patient at Crestwood Nursing Home. Nurses had to play rock, paper, scissors to decide who would go in. Doctors cut their visits down to the bare minimum. No one came to see him. Not a single phone call. Not a single bouquet of flowers. For 2 straight years, room 214 held only him and 4 green walls he hated with a bitter passion. Then one afternoon, the little daughter of the woman who mopped the floors slipped in, set the cookie on a paper towel beside his bed, and ran. He never once said thank you. He complained the cookie was dry. He complained it was hard. He complained it was too sweet. He complained there were too many raisins. But every day, the cookie disappeared, down to the last crumb. It was their secret, just the 2 of them, a 5-year-old girl and a 71-year-old man. Until one afternoon, everything stopped. The little girl walked up to room 214 like always, but today the door stood wide open. The bed was empty. Not the kind of empty that meant someone had gone for a walk or been moved down the hall. The thin blanket was gone. The sheets were gone. Even the pillow Walt complained about every day, the one he said was too hard, was gone too. All that remained was the pale vinyl mattress lying there exposed, stripped and silent, like something had just been robbed of its last shred of dignity. The room no longer smelled of old newspapers and the familiar sting of rubbing oil. It smelled only of harsh disinfectant, the smell of being wiped clean. The little girl stood there, still holding the wax paper bag, and the cookie inside suddenly felt heavy as lead. The familiar rasping cough she always heard the moment she stepped in was gone, replaced by pure silence. Then a strange sound rose from the far end of the hallway. It wasn't the soft shuffle of a doctor's shoes. It wasn't the squeak of a nurse's soles. It was the sound of leather shoes, heavy and sharp, each step striking the tile like the beat of a war drum. The entire nursing home froze. The nurse pushing the medication cart stopped short. The janitor paused mid-wipe. 3 men walked in, black suits, moving in lockstep, their eyes sweeping the corridor as if they were surveying a battlefield. Leading them was a silver-haired man with a ramrod straight back, the kind of man whose walk belonged to someone used to giving orders, not taking them. He wasn't there for the director. He wasn't there for paperwork. He had come for the patient in room 214 and for the little girl with the cookie. No one in the nursing home that day knew that the cranky old man in room 214, the one nurses had to gamble on to serve, the one who couldn't even hold a spoon on his own but was too proud to ask anyone for help, had once been the most powerful boss in the city, the man who controlled an underground empire for 30 years. And that oatmeal raisin cookie the 5-year-old carried in every day, the cookie her mother baked with hands that bled after 12 hours of mopping floors, was going to change the lives of that mother and daughter forever. But before we get to that part, we need to turn back 3 months, to the cleaning supply closet on the 2nd floor, where a young mother hid her little girl among chemical buckets and gave her 3 rules. Don't go outside, don't make a sound, don't talk to anyone. Invisible meant safe. But that 5-year-old girl refused to be invisible. And that was the beginning of everything. If this story touched something in you, hit like so more people can hear it. Share this video with someone you think needs to be reminded that kindness is never forgotten. And if you want to stay with stories like this, subscribe. We'll see you again in the next one. 3 months before room 214 became an empty room, it was the room no one wanted to step into. At Crestwood Nursing Home, everyone knew the patient in room 214, but no one knew who he really was. His admission file was nearly blank, with only a name: Walter Porter, age 71, no next of kin, no private insurance, no declared assets, not a single line written in the section for emergency contact. The administrator assumed he'd been a manual laborer because his hands were covered in calluses, his knuckles swollen, and old scars ran from the backs of his hands up to his wrists, like a map of a life nobody wanted to ask about. He checked himself in 2 years earlier, walked in on his own, signed the intake forms with his assumed name, chose the room at the very end of the hallway, and then shut the door as if he were closing the final chapter of a book no one had ever read. From that day on, he was angry at everything. He was angry at the flickering fluorescent lights in the ceiling. He was angry at the television next door turned up too loud. He was angry at the smell of floor cleaner. Angry at the way nurses knocked. Angry at the rattle of the cartwheels in the corridor every morning. Head nurse Brenda Foley called him the hardest case in 15 years on the job. Every shift, the nurses played rock, paper, scissors to see who had to go into his room, and the loser always sighed like they'd just been handed a sentence. He yelled at the nurse bringing his medicine. He yelled at the doctor trying to check on him. He even yelled at the mail carrier who'd wandered onto the wrong floor. The whole nursing home called him by a name he never knew, Walt the Wall, because no one, not a single soul, could get through the wall he'd built around himself. But Darcy Wren saw what the others didn't, not because she was sharper than them, but because her job was to clean up what other people left behind. Every morning, when Darcy pushed her cleaning cart into room 214, she noticed something that happened over and over again. His meal tray was almost untouched. The green gelatin wasn't disturbed. The porridge sat cold. The bread lay stiff and dry on the plate. At first, she thought he was picky, the way he was difficult about everything. But then she saw the spoon. It wasn't on the tray. It was on the floor, beside the bed leg, in a different spot each day. She looked closer. His hands were badly swollen at the joints, his fingers twisted, trembling whenever he tried to hold anything at all. He didn't hate the food. He couldn't hold the spoon. But he'd rather go hungry than let anyone see him weak. Darcy didn't say a word. She simply picked the spoon up, set the tray back the way it belonged, and cleaned the room as if nothing had happened. But every time she lifted that spoon, she felt something tighten in her chest. A familiar feeling, the ache of someone who understood what it meant to hide pain behind a closed door. She noticed something else, too. On the windowsill in his room, there was an old coin. It wasn't a normal quarter. It was heavier, larger, with a faded eagle on one side and some kind of symbol on the other. Every morning, when Darcy came in to clean, the coin sat in exactly the same place, turned at exactly the same angle, as if he'd set it there with all the precision his trembling hands still had left. It was the habit of a man who'd once controlled everything, and now could control only the position of a single coin. Then that afternoon came. Darcy was cleaning room 214, bent down wiping beneath the bed, when she heard the sound of tiny footsteps outside the door. She looked up. Her heart stalled for a beat. Maeve stood in the doorway of room 214, both hands gripping the frame, her head tilted to one side, her green eyes wide as she stared inside. Walter was sitting in the chair by the window with his back turned. He turned around. He saw the child. His gray-blue eyes, the eyes the whole nursing home avoided, the eyes nurses said could freeze blood, locked onto the 5-year-old standing in his doorway. "What?" he growled. His voice sounded like crushed gravel. "This isn't a zoo. Get out." Darcy was ready to rush over and pull her away. She was ready to apologize, to lower her head, to disappear, to be invisible, the way she always did. But Maeve didn't run. She stood still. She tilted her head the other way, looking at the old man snarling at her with eyes that held not a single trace of fear. Then she asked, her voice clear as a bell, "Sir, does your hand hurt? Why don't you tell the nurse to feed you?" Walter Thornton, 71 years old, the man no one in the nursing home could break through, the man nurses had to play rock, paper, scissors just to enter, opened his mouth to yell again, but no sound came out. He stared at the little girl. Those razor-sharp eyes blinked once. Then he turned his face away, looked out the window, and didn't say another word. That night, Darcy couldn't sleep. She lay on a thin mattress in a cramped rented room, with Maeve curled up beside her, her daughter's steady breathing brushing softly against Darcy's neck. But Darcy's mind kept circling back to that moment. The moment Maeve stood in the doorway of room 214, looked straight into the face of the old man the entire nursing home was afraid of, and asked if he was in pain. Darcy had pulled Maeve away right after. She'd apologized to him, even though he didn't look at her, didn't answer, only sat there staring out the window as if she and her child had never existed. She'd led Maeve back to the supply closet, knelt down until she was level with her daughter's eyes, and spoke in the sternest voice she could force out. "You're not allowed to go into patients' rooms. Not ever. Do you understand?" Maeve nodded, but those green eyes didn't look at her mother. They looked through the closet door, through the hallway beyond it, toward room 214. And Darcy knew, with the instinct of a mother who'd learned to read what wasn't spoken, that her daughter wasn't afraid of that old man. That frightened her more than anything else. The next morning, Darcy went into room 214 earlier than usual. She wanted to finish cleaning before Maeve woke up in the supply closet, before the little girl had a chance to slip out again. She pushed the door open, let her eyes drop to the floor out of habit, and started to mop. Walter sat in his chair, his back to the window. He didn't shout. He didn't growl. The silence was so strange that Darcy lifted her head and looked. He was watching her. Not with the irritated stare she'd grown used to, but with a look that measured, that weighed, that decided what she was. Darcy lowered her gaze and kept mopping. Her heart beat faster, but her hands kept a steady rhythm. She'd learned how to do that a long time ago, to keep her hands calm when everything inside her was in chaos. "That little girl?" Walter said suddenly, his voice rough but not sharp. "Your kid?" Darcy stopped mid-stroke. She didn't look up. "Yes, sir. I'm sorry about yesterday. It won't happen again." Silence stretched out. Darcy thought he'd let it go. She went back to mopping toward the space beneath the bed. Then he spoke again. Quieter. Almost not a question at all. More like a statement. "She isn't scared." Darcy stilled. She looked up. Walter had already turned his face back toward the window. All Darcy could see was the back of his head, the stiff silver hair, the narrow slope of his shoulders beneath the thin hospital gown. He didn't say anything else. Neither did she. She finished the room, picked up the spoon from the floor like she did every day, set the tray back in place, and walked out. But this time, when she put the spoon down, she saw something she'd never seen on Walter Thornton's meal tray before. The bread had been broken. Just a tiny piece snapped off at the corner, so small it was almost nothing. But it had been broken. Someone had tried to eat. Darcy looked at Walter's hand resting on the arm of the chair, the swollen, twisted fingers, the inflamed joints. He had tried. With hands even the doctor had said were almost without function, he had tried to break off a piece of bread, and he had managed one small bite. Darcy stepped into the hallway and closed the door to room 214 behind her. She stood there for a moment, her back against the wall, her hand still holding a damp cleaning cloth. She thought about the spoon on the floor every morning. She thought about the broken corner of bread. She thought about what he'd said. She isn't scared. And she thought about Maeve, her 5-year-old, sitting on an overturned bucket in that chemical-filled supply closet, drawing an old white-haired man with a dull pencil. Darcy bit her lip. She knew her daughter would go back to room 214, not tomorrow, not the day after, but she would go back, because Maeve Wren, 5 years old, had seen what no one in that nursing home had seen. That old man wasn't cranky. He was hurting. Darcy was right. 3 days after that afternoon, Maeve went back. The little girl waited until exactly 4 o'clock, when Darcy was mopping rooms on the first floor, when head nurse Brenda was on her break, when the second-floor hallway was at its emptiest. Maeve climbed down from the overturned bucket, opened the supply closet door without making a sound, and walked along the corridor on tiny feet she'd practiced all week to keep as quiet as possible. In her hand was the wax paper bag, and inside it was an oatmeal raisin cookie her mother had baked the night before. She stopped in front of room 214. The door was slightly open. Inside, the television murmured low. Maeve drew in a breath, stepped in, set the cookie on the paper towel on the bedside table, then turned and ran back out. Her heart hammered. She ran so fast her shoes almost slipped on the glossy tile. She burst into the supply closet, shut the door, dropped onto the overturned bucket, and panted. She felt like she'd just done something enormous, like the cartoon robbers she'd watched back when they still had a television. The next day, at exactly 4 o'clock, Maeve slipped out again. She went to room 214, took a breath, and stepped inside. The cookie from yesterday was gone. The paper towel was still there, but all that remained were a few tiny crumbs. He'd eaten it. The old man the whole nursing home said wouldn't eat anything had eaten her cookie. Every bit of it. Maeve smiled. She placed a new cookie on the paper towel and ran again. On the third day, she was more confident. She stepped in without running, set the cookie on the table, and as she turned, a rough voice sounded behind her. "You!" Cookie ghost. Maeve stopped short. She turned around slowly. Walter was sitting in his chair, eyes open, staring straight at her. He wasn't asleep. Maybe he'd never been asleep when she came in. Maybe he'd been lying there, pretending, listening to those tiny footsteps on the tile, and waiting. "Oatmeal raisin," he said, his voice like stones grinding together. "My wife liked oatmeal. I liked chocolate." Maeve blinked. "I only have oatmeal. My mom bakes that kind." Walter looked at the cookie, dry. He picked it up, his hand shaking, brought it to his mouth, and chewed slowly. Chewed for a long time. Then he swallowed. Hard. He took another bite, finished it. Maeve stood by the door, not sure if she should run or stay. "Why are you standing there?" he snapped. "You're letting the draft in. Either come in or get out. Pick one." Maeve stepped farther into the room. From that day on, it became routine. 4 o'clock in the afternoon, Maeve came, cookie on the paper towel. Walter complained. Every day he complained about something different. Too sweet. Not enough raisins. Too many raisins. Too thin. Too thick. But not a single day did even one piece of cookie get left behind. And little by little, between the complaints, he started to ask questions. "You go to school?" "No, sir. My mom hasn't gotten me signed up yet." "You know how to count?" "Yes, sir. Up to 20. "What good is 20? "You've got to count to 100. "Do you see the cat outside the window?" Maeve asked back. "The striped cat. It likes to lie on the wall." "A stray," Walter snapped. "Don't touch it. Strays scratch. But it's cute. Cute still scratches." The afternoons drifted on like that. Maeve talked. Walter listened. Walter complained. Maeve laughed. Room 214, the room that for 2 years had held nothing but medicine smells and silence, began to carry the laughter of a 5-year-old through the crack of its half-open door. Then that afternoon came. Maeve brought the cookie like always. Walter reached for it. But today his hand shook more than usual. His swollen, crooked fingers wouldn't cooperate. The cookie slipped from his grasp and fell onto the blanket. He swore under his breath, a low, angry growl. He tried to pick it up, but the joints in his fingers were stiff, refusing every command. The cookie lay there on the blanket, just inches from him, and it might as well have been miles away. Maeve didn't ask. She didn't say, "Let me help." She simply stepped forward, picked the cookie up, held it in her 2 tiny hands, and lifted it to his mouth. Walter looked at her. Those gray-blue eyes, the eyes the nursing home said could freeze blood, blinked and blinked again. He turned his face toward the window, but Maeve had already seen it. His eyes were red. He leaned forward and took a small bite from the cookie in her hands. Then another bite. Then another. Neither of them said a word. There was only the soft, crisp crack of the cookie breaking in the quiet room. The smallest sound, and the warmest sound room 214 had ever held. When the cookie was gone, Walter wiped his mouth with the back of his hand. He rummaged through the bedside drawer, his hand trembling, his fingers fumbling past pill bottles and paper towels until he pulled out something small, heavy, dimly gleaming. He closed his fist around it, then placed it in Maeve's palm. The coin, heavier than an ordinary coin, an eagle stamped on one side. "Here," he said, his voice rougher than usual. "Pay for the cookies. It's junk. Don't get excited." Maeve stared at the coin in her hand. She didn't know what it was. She didn't know what it was worth. But she knew the old man had handed her something that belonged to him. And it was the first time he'd given anyone anything in 2 years in that room. Maeve beamed, the kind of smile only a 5-year-old can have. A smile without calculation, without hesitation. And then she ran back to the supply closet with the coin and hid it beneath a neatly stacked pile of towels in the corner, careful, as if she were hiding treasure. That secret ritual lasted exactly 2 months. At the end of that second month, everything collapsed. That afternoon, Maeve was sitting on the edge of Walter's bed, her legs swinging, not quite reaching the floor, her mouth busy telling him about the striped cat outside the window that she'd named Stripes. Walter was chewing the last piece of cookie, cutting in now and then with the kind of gruff remarks he always used. Things like, "Strays don't need names," or, "What happens when you name it and it leaves?" When a shadow fell across the threshold. Maeve looked up. Walter looked up. Head nurse Brenda Foley stood in the doorway of room 214, arms folded across her chest, her face cold as stone. "Maeve Wren," she said, her voice sharp and slow, the voice of someone who'd been holding back for a long time and had no intention of holding back anymore. "What are you doing in here?" "The kid isn't doing anything," Walter snapped from his chair. "She's sitting here. She's talking about a cat. She hasn't broken a damn thing." Brenda didn't look at Walter. She looked at Maeve with the kind of expression Maeve understood right away meant she was in very big trouble. "Come with me," Brenda said. Then she turned on her heel, her shoes striking the hallway, and Maeve knew she had to follow. Maeve slid down off the bed. She looked at Walter. He didn't look at her. He'd already turned his face toward the window, like he always did when he didn't want anyone to see him. Maeve walked out of room 214 with heavier steps than she'd ever taken going in. Brenda didn't take Maeve back to the supply closet. She took her straight to the director's office. And Darcy was already there. Her mother's face was chalk white. Darcy didn't say a word on the walk back to the supply closet. She held Maeve's hand, moved fast, eyes forward, jaw clenched. Only when the supply closet door shut behind them did Darcy drop to her knees, grip her daughter's shoulders with both hands, and speak in a voice that trembled all over. "You know the rules. You know them. What did I say? Don't go out. Don't make noise. Don't talk to anyone. 3 rules. 3. Maeve lowered her head. Tears started to spill. Brenda told the director. The director told me. "One more time and I lose my job. Do you understand what losing my job means? It means no money. No rent money. No money to buy flour. No cookies to bake for you to take." Darcy's voice rose higher than she meant it to. She saw Maeve flinch, saw those tiny shoulders draw in, and she hated herself for yelling. But she was scared. She was so scared the fear turned into anger. "But Mama," Maeve whispered through her sobs, "Walt doesn't have anybody. Nobody goes into his room. He eats alone and his hand hurts. Nobody saves cookies for him." Darcy stopped. Her hands were still on her daughter's shoulders, but the grip loosened. She looked at Maeve's face, at the tears sliding down her cheeks, at the green eyes staring up at her not with fear but with confusion, the confusion of a child who couldn't understand why kindness got punished. Darcy felt something crack inside her chest. She knew her daughter was right, but she also knew the world didn't reward the right thing. The world rewarded the invisible. "Don't go to room 214 anymore," Darcy said, quieter now, more tired. "Promise me." Maeve nodded. On the first day, Maeve sat on the overturned bucket and drew. Darcy peeked as she passed by. On the paper, the dull pencil scratched out the shape of a white-haired old man sitting by a window. On the second day, Maeve kept drawing. The same old man, but this time he sat alone. No one beside him, and the window in the drawing was bigger than he was. Darcy looked at the stack of drawings piled in the corner of the supply closet. 7 or 8 pages, all of the same person. A 5-year-old was drawing longing without even knowing there was a word for it. On the third day, at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, Darcy was mopping rooms on the first floor. She finished, wrung out her cloth, pushed her cart back to the supply closet, and opened the door. The overturned bucket was empty. The dull pencil lay on the floor. Maeve wasn't there. Darcy's heart dropped into her stomach. She knew immediately. She knew exactly where her daughter was. On the second floor, at the end of the hallway, room 214. Maeve pushed the door open and stepped inside, and she saw something she had never seen in all those weeks. Walter wasn't sitting with his face turned toward the window. He was in his chair, but the chair had been turned. He was facing the door. He was looking at the door, as if he'd been sitting there, staring at it, and waiting. 2 days. When he saw her, his face changed, just for a fraction of a second. So fast that if Maeve blinked, she would have missed it. Something lit in his gray-blue eyes. Something softened in the lines of his deeply wrinkled face. Then, instantly, the wall came back up. His mouth tightened, his brow pulled down, his voice snapped. "You're late." Darcy ran up to the second floor, leaving her cleaning cart in the middle of the first-floor hallway, not even taking off her rubber gloves, not having time to think about anything except that her daughter was in the one place where, if Brenda caught her again, Darcy would lose her job, lose her income, lose the rented room she'd just paid for this month. She tore down the second-floor corridor, past room 210, past room 212, and skidded to a stop in front of room 214. The door was cracked open. Inside, Maeve was sitting on the low plastic chair beside Walter's bed, holding an old magazine in both hands, raised properly in front of her face. The magazine was upside down. Maeve couldn't read, but she was pretending, using the most serious voice a 5-year-old could manage. "Once upon a time," Maeve read, her eyes fixed on an upside-down toothpaste advertisement. "There was a fish that could fly. It flew up into the sky and met a bird that could swim. There's no fish that can fly. Walter said from his chair, his voice sharp but his eyes not sharp. There is, Maeve said without looking up. Flying fish. My mom says there is. Your mom is wrong. My mom is never wrong. Walter looked at the child. He didn't smile, but the corner of his mouth twitched, the kind of twitch that belonged to someone trying to hold back something he'd forgotten how to do a long time ago. All right, he said. Keep going. Darcy stood in the doorway, rubber gloves still on her hands, her mouth already open, ready to scold. But the scolding didn't come out. She stood there and watched her daughter sitting in the room of the crankiest old man in the nursing home, holding a magazine upside down, making up stories about flying fish and swimming birds, and that old man was listening. He was really listening. Darcy stepped inside and closed the door behind her. The sound made both Maeve and Walter look up. Maeve's eyes went wide, knowing she'd been caught. Walter looked Darcy up and down, those gray-blue eyes sliding over her floor mop uniform, the rubber gloves, the worn flat shoes, and then stopping on her face. Before you yell at the kid, he said. Not loud, not soft, just level and solid. You should know she's the only person in this place who isn't afraid of me. I'm not afraid of you, Darcy said. The words came out faster than she expected, like a reflex, the same way she used to say I'm fine when her ribs weren't even healed. Walter tilted his head. He looked at her longer, not with irritation, not with contempt, with the gaze of a man who'd spent a lifetime reading people, reading fast, reading true, and not needing anyone to confirm it. You're afraid of everything, he said. Darcy went rigid. You're afraid of losing your job. You're afraid of your ex-husband's shadow. You're afraid of people seeing you. You're so afraid you're teaching your daughter how to become invisible. Each sentence landed like a stone thrown straight into the center of her chest. Darcy wanted to argue, wanted to tell him he was wrong. But she couldn't speak, because he wasn't wrong. I'm good at reading people, Miss Wren, Walter said, his voice slowing. I made my living doing it my whole life. Darcy didn't know what kind of work he meant. She didn't ask. But she felt something strange happening in room 214 then. Something she'd never experienced in 27 years of being alive. Someone was looking at her. Not looking at her mopping floors. Not looking at a victim. Not looking at a woman hiding from an ex-husband with a child tucked away among chemical buckets. Looking at her. Darcy Wren. And she didn't know what to do with the feeling. It was more frightening than Troy, because Troy looked at her to control her. This old man looked at her because he saw her. Two completely different things. I've got a proposal, Walter said. He looked at Maeve, then back at Darcy. The kid comes here every day. I don't tell anyone. Foley doesn't know. The director doesn't know. Why? Darcy asked. Because I'm old, Walter said. His voice lost some of its bite, leaving only the roughness of a man saying something he'd been thinking for a long time, but had never said out loud. I don't need pity. I don't need anyone wiping my face or helping me to the toilet. I need someone who isn't afraid of me. Your kid, she isn't afraid. You aren't there yet, but you're learning. Maeve sat very still on the chair, looking at her mother, looking at Mr. Walt, then looking back at her mother, like she was watching a game she didn't know the rules to but could tell was important. Darcy looked at her daughter, looked at the old man, looked at the room with the spoon on the floor and the coin on the windowsill. She thought about Brenda, thought about the director, thought about the written warning in her employee file, thought about Troy, thought about rent. Then she looked back into Walter's eyes. The eyes the whole nursing home said could freeze blood. But right now, in those eyes, Darcy saw only one thing: loneliness. The kind of loneliness she knew well, the kind she saw every morning in the mirror. Darcy nodded. She didn't say anything else. Walter nodded back. A quiet agreement formed between a young mother of 27 and an old man of 71. Between a floor cleaner and the patient in room 214. Cookies in exchange for companionship. And both of them knew, even without saying it, that they were trading far more than that. From the day that quiet agreement was sealed with a nod in room 214, the afternoons began to take shape. 4 o'clock, Maeve left the supply closet with the wax paper bag. 4:10, she sat on the low plastic chair beside Walter's bed. 4:11, Walter complained about the cookie. 4:12, he ate every last bit of it. He kept up his daily critique, rotating through his usual list of grievances: the sugar, the texture, the raisins, but with each passing day, his tone lost its sting. On Friday, he complained exactly like Monday, only with a more irritated tone. Not a single day did any cookie remain. Maeve told stories. Walter listened. She told him about the striped cat, Stripes, who now seemed to know to lie down in front of the nursing home every morning. She told him about the janitor, Ray, who liked to sneak a box of fruit juice outside the supply closet, then mutter, "Somebody dropped this. Better clean it up." She told him about last night's dream, how she dreamed she could fly, but only up to knee height. Walter listened to all of it. He didn't say much, but he asked questions. "That Ray kid, what juice does he leave? Apple or orange? Does the cat eat? What good is flying to your knees?" The questions were gruff, but they were questions. And Maeve understood, the way children understand everything by instinct instead of language, that he was truly listening. Darcy began to change, too. At first, she only stopped by room 214 to check on Maeve, standing in the doorway, looking in, then leaving. But little by little, after her mopping shift, she started to stay a few minutes longer. She adjusted the pillow Walter always complained was too hard but never asked anyone to replace. She brought him a bowl of hot soup from the kitchen instead of the cold meal tray he never touched. She didn't talk much, neither did Walter, but the silence between them had changed its texture. No longer the silence of strangers, but the silence of people who didn't need words in order to understand. Sometimes Walter told stories, but always vaguely, always in half measures, as if he were walking a wire between wanting to speak and the habit of hiding. "When I was young, I did business too," he said one afternoon, looking out the window. "Sold all kinds of things. Busy. Didn't have time to sit around watching stray cats." "What did you sell?" Maeve asked. "All kinds of things," Walter repeated, and that was all. But every time he said, "when I was young," his eyes changed. Not sadness, not nostalgia. Something heavier, like a man carrying a suitcase no one could see, but it was always there. Then that afternoon came. Maeve was sitting on the floor of room 214, drawing Mr. Walt with a dull pencil on the back of an old test paper she'd pulled from the trash. When she finished, she held it up, looked at him, and asked, "Mr. Walt, what am I to you?" Walter looked at her. "What are you?" "You're the cookie ghost. I told you." "No." Maeve shook her head. "I'm not a ghost. I'm your friend." Walter didn't answer right away. He looked at her, looked at the picture she'd drawn, looked at the paper towel on the table still dotted with crumbs. Then he spoke, his voice gravelier than usual, slower than usual, heavier than usual. "You aren't my friend. You're the quartermaster." Maeve frowned. "What's a quartermaster?" "A quartermaster is the one who hands out food to soldiers. You hand out cookies. You're the quartermaster." Maeve thought hard, lips puckered, the expression of a child processing information with every ounce of 5-year-old brain power she had. Then she grinned, wide enough to show her missing tooth. "So you're my soldier?" Walter went quiet for a long time. His gray-blue eyes looked out the window at the evening sky changing color. Then he turned back, looked at her, and his voice was so hoarse, it was almost only breath. "Yeah, I'm your soldier." Maeve laughed even louder. She didn't understand why those words were heavy. She only felt happy that Mr. Walt was her soldier. But outside the door, Darcy stood with her back against the wall, a stack of towels hugged to her chest, and she had heard everything. She bit her lip until she tasted blood, because if she didn't bite down, she would have cried right there in the hallway. That night, Maeve went back to the supply closet to sleep on a pile of towels stacked into a pillow. Darcy returned to room 214 to do the final cleaning of the day. Walter was sitting in the dark, the room lights turned off, only the hallway light slipping through the crack under the door and laying a thin stripe of brightness across the floor. Darcy cleaned in silence. She thought he was asleep. Then his voice came, small, not sharp, not a growl, just the voice of a 71-year-old man speaking in the dark to the only person willing to listen. "Miss Wren, I used to have a wife." Darcy stopped wiping. "She died because of me, because of the life I chose, because of the world I built. I couldn't protect her." Silence. Darcy didn't turn around, didn't look at him, because she understood there were words a person could only say when no one was looking at their face. "My son got ruined because of me. He looked at me and learned. He learned the worst things. Then I wanted him to stop, and he wouldn't stop. I walked away. 10 years. His voice shook. Not the shaking of weakness, the shaking of weight. "I'm not a good man, Miss Wren. I've done a lot of bad things. I came in here not to be loved. I came in here to see if I deserve to be seen by anyone. After everything I've done." The room sank into darkness and breathing. Darcy stood there with her back still to Walter, her hand still holding the damp cloth. She thought about his swollen joints, about the spoon on the floor every morning, about the coin turned to the exact angle on the windowsill, about the old man who'd turned his chair toward the door and waited for a 5-year-old for 2 straight days. She didn't know what he'd done. She didn't need to know. She knew that look. The look of someone who hated himself. She saw it every morning in the mirror. Darcy turned around. She looked at him in the dark. Her voice was quiet, but it didn't tremble. "You deserve it." Walter looked at her. For the first time, those gray-blue eyes weren't sharp. They were simply the eyes of a tired old man who'd waited a long time to hear a sentence he probably didn't believe, but needed more than anything. "My wife used to say that too," he whispered. Then he turned his face back toward the window, and Darcy knew the conversation was over. But something between them had just begun. That morning, Darcy arrived at the nursing home half an hour early. She walked through the front entrance, swiped her employee card, and stepped into the familiar hallway that smelled of disinfectant and hot porridge. Everything looked the same as every other day, but Darcy didn't feel the same as every other day. Her hands were shaking, not the kind of shaking that came from cold or exhaustion, the kind that rose from inside, from somewhere deeper than bone, deeper than muscle, from the place she thought she'd buried for good 6 months ago, the night she'd lifted Maeve onto a late bus and disappeared. Last night, at 2 a.m, her phone had vibrated, an unknown number. She'd answered by instinct, because for 6 months she'd answered every unknown call in case it was the hospital, or the landlord, or anyone she couldn't afford to miss. There was no voice on the other end, only breathing, slow, even, the kind of breathing Darcy recognized immediately, because she'd heard it for hundreds of nights, when Troy lay beside her in the dark and she didn't dare move, afraid of waking whatever lived inside him. Then the line went dead. Darcy sat on the thin mattress with the phone in her hand, the screen dark, and the whole rented room seemed to shrink around her. Maeve slept beside her, brown curls spread across the pillow, her breathing steady. Darcy looked at her child, and the fear she thought she'd left behind in the old city came back whole and intact, as if it had never been gone at all. Troy had found her. All morning, Darcy mopped floors with hands that shook so badly she dropped the water bucket twice. The second time, Ray walked by, saw her, and stopped. "Darcy, you okay?" She didn't look at him. "I'm fine." Her voice was flat and thin as paper. At 4 o'clock in the afternoon, Darcy went up to the second floor to clean room 214. Maeve was already there, telling Walter how Stripes had caught a butterfly today. Darcy stepped inside, trying to keep her face normal, trying to keep her hands from trembling, trying to keep her voice even when she told Maeve, "Go back to the supply closet first, honey. I'll come when I'm done cleaning." Maeve left. The door hadn't even closed yet when Walter spoke. "He found you." Not a question. A statement, like when he'd said, "She isn't scared." About Maeve, like when he'd said, "You're afraid of everything." Walter Thornton didn't ask. He looked and he knew. Darcy stood in the middle of the room with her back to him, a damp cloth in her hand. She didn't turn around. She didn't answer. But her shoulders shook, and a tear fell onto the tile she'd just finished mopping. Just one. But it was enough. "You're going to run," Walter said. "Not a question. Don't." Darcy bit her lip. "I don't have money, Mr. Thornton. I don't have anywhere to go. I just... Listen to me." Walter's voice changed. It wasn't rough anymore. It wasn't sharp anymore. It went cold, slow. Each word cut like steel, each one driving down like a nail into hard wood. The voice of a man who used to give orders, and people had to obey. "You're not going anywhere. You stay here. The kid stays here. No one touches my quartermaster. I promise." Darcy turned around. She looked at him. A 71-year-old man with swollen joints, a man who couldn't even hold a spoon, sitting in a nursing home chair in a gown thin as paper. He had nothing. He was nothing. At least, nothing she understood. But the sound of his voice, the look in his eyes, the way he said the words "I promise" like it was a sentence the whole world would have to follow, made Darcy feel something that, for the first time in 6 months, came close to safety. She didn't understand why. She wouldn't understand for a long time. That night, when Crestwood Nursing Home sank into darkness, when the night nurse nodded off behind the desk, Walter Thornton took an old phone from the drawer of his bedside table. He dialed a number he knew by heart. The person on the other end picked up after 2 rings. "Pen," Walter said, not whispering, not hiding, speaking with the voice of a man who'd decided, "Run an investigation on a man named Troy Sutter. Activate the protection protocol for Miss Wren. And Pen, get another house ready. My quartermaster needs somewhere safe." 2 weeks after that late-night phone call, Walter Thornton was gone. He went in his sleep, sometime between 3 and 5 in the morning, in the blackest stretch of night, when Crestwood Nursing Home held only the hum of the air filters and the measured footsteps of the night nurse making rounds. The nurse found him at 15 minutes to 6. He was lying in bed, the blanket pulled up to his chest, his head slightly turned toward the window. His face was peaceful. That was what the night nurse wrote in the logbook, and what she would repeat to her coworkers for weeks afterward, that for the first time in 2 years, Walter Thornton's face wasn't tightened. No frown, no furrowed brow, no clenched jaw, only calm, as if he'd finally set down something he'd carried for a long time and had at last been allowed to let it go. On the bedside table, beside the pill bottle and the plastic cup, there was a folded piece of paper. The handwriting was shaky, but clear. Only one line. "Call Penn Hale. Number in the drawer." The eagle coin on the windowsill was still in its exact place. He'd turned it one last time the evening before. Darcy arrived at the nursing home at 7, like she did every morning. She swiped in, took her cleaning cart, and went up to the 2nd floor. She walked past room 214 and saw Ray standing outside the door. Ray wasn't mopping. Ray wasn't pushing a cart. Ray was just standing there, hat in his hand, head bowed, as if he were looking at something on the floor that no one else could see. Darcy stopped. She looked at Ray. Ray lifted his head. His eyes met hers, and he didn't say a single word. He didn't have to. Darcy understood. She understood at once. The way you understand things your body knows before your mind does. The way your breath catches for a beat before thought can even form. She didn't step into room 214. She didn't walk to the end of the hall. She turned right, went straight into the staff bathroom, shut the door, slid the lock, and sank down the cold tiled wall. She cried, silently, mouth clamped shut, shoulders shaking, tears slipping through her fingers into her palms, the kind of crying she'd learned a long time ago, from nights when Troy slept beside her and she didn't dare make a sound. The kind of crying no one hears. But this time, she wasn't crying from fear. She was crying from loss. She was crying because the cranky old man in room 214, the one who had seen her, the one who had told her she deserved to be seen, the one who had promised no one would touch the quartermaster, had left without saying goodbye. And she was crying because she knew that at 4 o'clock this afternoon, her daughter would carry the wax paper bag down to room 214, and there would be no one there to complain that the cookie was dry. Darcy wiped her eyes, opened the bathroom door, and stepped back out. She had to find Maeve first. She had to tell her. But she was too late. Maeve already knew how to open the supply closet door without making a sound. Maeve already knew the path to room 214 so well she could have walked it with her eyes closed. And Maeve, 5 years old, holding the wax paper bag with an oatmeal raisin cookie inside that her mother had baked the night before, went to room 214 before Darcy could stop her. Maeve pushed the door open. She stepped in. She set the bag on the bedside table, sat down on the low plastic chair, and waited. 5 minutes. 10 minutes. The room stayed quiet. No rasping cough. No sharp voice saying, "Dry," or "hard," or "you're late." Only the smell of disinfectant and absence. Maeve looked at the cookie on the table, looked at the chair by the window, empty. Looked at the windowsill, the coin gone, put away by someone. She slid off the chair, stepped out into the hallway, and saw her mother. Darcy stood at the end of the corridor, eyes red, hands clenched at the sides of her uniform. "Mama," Maeve said, her voice small, not understanding, not afraid, only confused. "Where did Mr. Walt go? I put the cookie down and he hasn't complained yet." Darcy didn't answer. She moved fast, dropped to her knees right there in the hallway, and pulled Maeve into her chest, tight as if she were afraid someone would rip her child out of her arms. Maeve didn't understand why her mother was holding her like that. She just hugged back, tiny arms around her mother's neck, and waited. Then, from the far end of the hallway, a sound carried toward them. Not soft shoes, not cartwheels, leather shoes, heavy, sharp, each step striking the tile. The silver-haired man stopped in front of Darcy. He was tall, his back straight, his black suit without a single wrinkle, his polished leather shoes catching the fluorescent hallway light like a mirror. Two other men stood behind him, the same black suits, the same measured stance, the same eyes sweeping the corridor as if checking every blind spot. The nursing home director hurried after them, face flushed, hands rubbing together, stammering something about how honored they were and how they hadn't been notified in advance. The silver-haired man didn't look at the director. He looked at Darcy. "Are you Darcy Wren?" Darcy tightened her hold on Maeve. Every instinct in her body was screaming the same word. Run. Someone had found her. Someone had sent people. Troy, the police, child services. She didn't know who, but she knew no man in a black suit came to a nursing home to bring good news to a woman who mopped floors. "Are you the mother of the child who brought cookies to the patient in room 214? Darcy nodded, her mouth gone dry. "My name is Pemberton Hale," he said. "I'm Walter Thornton's attorney. You need to come with me. Right now." "I didn't do anything wrong," Darcy said, her voice thin and fast. "My child didn't do anything wrong. If this is about her going into a patient's room, then Miss Wren," Penn cut in, his voice neither cold nor warm, the voice of someone used to serious conversations and with no time for what didn't matter. "This isn't about nursing home rules. Please come with me. I'll explain everything. But not here." A black car waited outside the front gate. Not a taxi, not a government vehicle. Long, dark-tinted windows, silent as a coffin on wheels. Darcy sat in the back seat with Maeve in her lap. Holding her so tight, Maeve had to squirm. "Mama, you're squeezing too hard." "I'm sorry, baby." Darcy loosened her arms but didn't let go. Penn sat up front beside the driver. He didn't speak the whole ride. Darcy stared out the window. Familiar streets fell away, replaced by roads she'd never taken. Buildings taller and cleaner. More glass, more light. The car turned into an underground garage beneath the tallest glass tower in the district, a private elevator. No buttons, only a card Penn swiped across a reader. The elevator rose fast and smooth, Darcy's ears popping slightly. When the doors opened, it wasn't a hallway. It was a room. But calling it a room was like calling the ocean a puddle. It was at least 10 times larger than Darcy's rented room. Dark wood, thick carpet, leather-bound books filling the walls. Floor-to-ceiling windows looked out over the entire city, and the city lay below them like a map. Darcy sat in the chair Penn pulled out for her. It was softer than anything she'd ever sat on. Maeve stayed on her mother's lap, eyes wide as she looked around, silent for the first time all day. Penn stood behind a massive oak desk. He didn't sit. He looked at Darcy, then at Maeve, then back at Darcy. He drew in a breath, the kind of breath a person takes before saying something they've prepared for a long time and still don't know how to begin. "Miss Wren," he said. Walter Thornton wasn't an unknown old man. Darcy stared at him. He wasn't a retired laborer. He wasn't a patient with nowhere to go. His file was empty because he wanted it empty. Penn opened a desk drawer, took out a leather portfolio, and set it on the desk. Walter Thornton, for more than 30 years, was the head of one of the largest empires in this city. He controlled transportation, real estate, logistics, and many other things I don't need to describe in detail. He wasn't an ordinary businessman, Miss Wren. He was the kind of man who spoke, and the whole city listened. Darcy didn't speak. She couldn't. Her mouth opened, but no words came. 20 years ago, his wife died, because of the life he chose. He retired. He handed power to his son. Then, 10 years ago, he disowned his son, because his son wouldn't stop. He disappeared. Penn paused. 2 years ago, Walter transferred all of his assets, hundreds of millions of dollars, into a trust that I manage. He cut off all contact. Then he walked into Crestwood Nursing Home himself, registered under an ordinary name, with no financial record, no family listed. He wanted to live his last days as a man, with nothing. He wanted to know whether, after everything he'd done in his life, the world would treat him kindly when he no longer had power, no longer had money, no longer had a name. Just an old man with swollen joints in room 214. Penn looked at Darcy, then at Maeve. 2 years, Miss Wren. 2 years he lay there. No one visited. No one called. Nurses played rock, paper, scissors to see who had to go in. Doctors shortened their visits. He tested the world, and the world failed. Penn stopped again. His voice dropped lower, until a 5-year-old girl slipped into his room, set an oatmeal raisin cookie on a paper towel, and ran. Darcy looked down at her hands, red, cracked, still dusted with a trace of flour from the cookies she'd baked the night before. Hands that mopped the floor of room 214 every day. Hands that kneaded dough every night, baked cookies, wrapped them in wax paper bags for her daughter to carry to the cranky old man. She had mopped the floor of the most powerful boss in the city. She had fed him soup with a plastic spoon, and her daughter had held cookies to his mouth with her tiny hands because his hands couldn't. Darcy looked up. She wanted to say something, but she couldn't find any words, because everything she thought she knew about the old man in room 214, everything, had shifted in the last 5 minutes. Everything except one thing. He was still the man who'd turned his chair toward the door and waited for her daughter for 2 straight days. Penn opened the leather briefcase. Inside was a hard-bound packet of papers, a sealed envelope, and a small key tied with a red string. He laid everything on the oak desk, his fingers arranging them into a neat order. The kind of neatness that comes from a man who has rehearsed this in his mind 100 times before ever having to do it. Walter didn't believe in long-winded wills, Penn said. He called this a post-war order. Simple, clear, impossible to twist. He flipped to the first page of the packet. Provision 1. For Darcy Wren, custodial staff at Crestwood Nursing Home, $500,000 in cash, and a house. Darcy heard the number, but it didn't land. It slid past her like a foreign language, like the television in the next room that played every day and still never belonged to her. 500,000. She was the woman who counted coins on the kitchen table each night. The woman who chose between the electric bill and the rent. The woman for whom $200 at the end of the month was the distance between having a roof and having nothing. The number Penn had just spoken didn't exist in her world. Walter wrote the purpose down plainly. Penn continued, his voice steady, reading directly from the page. So that Miss Wren will never have to be invisible again. Darcy blinked. That word, invisible, he knew. The cranky old man in room 214, the man she thought noticed nothing but cookies and nurses to yell at, had heard the word she whispered to her daughter every day. Invisible meant safe, and he had written it into his will. The house is in a quiet neighborhood on the west side of the city, Penn said. Walter has owned it for more than 30 years. He called it his quiet place. Small house, white paint, blue door, paid off, utilities already on. The kitchen cabinets already stocked. He wanted you safe, Miss Wren, especially now. Darcy understood what especially now meant. Troy. Walter had called Penn about Troy. He had prepared for this. Provision 2, Penn said. For Maeve Wren, your daughter. A trust fund. The amount in the trust is substantial, Miss Wren. Far more than what I just said. I will manage it until Maeve reaches adulthood. Maeve sat on Darcy's lap, legs swinging, looking around the huge room with the curiosity of a child who didn't understand any of it but could feel that everything was important. She didn't hear the numbers. She was watching a pigeon perched outside the glass. Provision 3, Penn said. He leaned over the desk and pulled out, from beneath it, a dark blue-painted metal box, old and heavy, its corners scuffed, the lid held shut by a metal latch. Walter called this his junk. He left it to Maeve. Penn flipped the latch. The lid popped open with a dry clack. Inside, arranged neatly with the precision of someone who'd spent his life putting everything in its place, was an eagle coin like the one Maeve was hiding beneath the stack of towels, a few small keepsakes, and 2 notebooks. The first was leather-bound, old, the edges worn, softened by time. The second was a cheap spiral notebook, the kind sold at a dollar store, the exact kind Maeve used to draw the white-haired old man. The leather one is Walter's personal journal, Penn explained. He wrote in it his whole life. The spiral notebook is the journal he kept at the nursing home. Every day, for 2 years. I sent someone to notarize it every week. It's a legal document. Darcy stared at the 2 notebooks inside the metal box, the journals of the old man whose spoon she'd picked up from the floor every morning. 2 years of writing. Every day. Alone. There's one more thing, Penn said. His voice changed, gentler, more careful, like a man reaching toward a bruise. Walter had a son. His name is Jude Thornton. Darcy looked up. Jude is Walter's only son. 10 years ago, Walter disowned Jude because Jude refused to leave the world Walter had walked away from. They haven't spoken since. Not one call. Not one letter. Until now. Penn picked up the sealed envelope on the desk. Walter left Jude exactly one thing. This letter. No money. No property. Just a letter. He set the envelope back down, carefully, as if it were fragile. Then he looked at Darcy. Darcy sat in a chair softer than anything she'd ever sat in a room larger than anywhere she'd ever stepped, with numbers she couldn't process and a house she didn't dare believe in, and she said the only thing she could say, "I don't deserve any of this." Penn didn't look surprised. He nodded slowly, as if he'd been waiting for that exact sentence. "Walter said you'd say that," Penn said. "He told me to answer you like this." Penn looked straight into Darcy's eyes. "It's because you think that you do." At the same time, on the other side of the city, in a penthouse on the highest floor of a building no one entered without permission, Jude Thornton sat in the dark. The room was vast and cold, the curtains drawn tight. The only light came from the phone screen on the table, a screen that had just gone black after a call from Penn Hale. The call had lasted 4 minutes and 12 seconds. Jude knew exactly because he'd looked at the clock when he answered, and looked again when he hung up. 4 minutes and 12 seconds to learn his father was dead. In a nursing home, alone. 2 years under his nose and he hadn't known. Jude held a glass of liquor in his hand. He didn't drink. He only held it, fingers tightening around the bowl, tighter, tighter still, until the glass shattered. Shards bit into his palm, into the webs between his fingers. Blood spilled, dark red, dripping onto the polished black wood table. He didn't let go of the broken glass. He didn't wipe the blood. He sat there watching it run between his fingers and felt nothing. Or he felt too much, until everything canceled itself into emptiness. Jude Thornton, 36 years old, the boss, the man who walked into a room and people stood, the man who spoke and no one interrupted, the man who controlled half this city with the fear he drove into the spine of anyone who stared at him too long. And he had just learned his father had died 20 minutes away by car, in a cheap nursing home, on a bed with a hard pillow, wearing a hospital gown thin as paper, and not one person in the empire Jude had built had known his father was there. The last message Walter had sent Jude was 10 years ago. One line. "When you want to live differently, you know how to find me." Jude never answered. 10 years. He'd opened that message thousands of times, read it again and again, typed a reply, then deleted it, typed it again, then deleted it again. 10 years of composing a message he never sent, and now there was no one on the other end to receive it. The next day, Jude went to Penn's office. He went alone, with no one at his side, something the people around him would have found strange if they'd known, because Jude Thornton never went anywhere alone. But this wasn't a boss's business. This was a son's. Penn handed Jude a copy of the will. Jude read it, line by line. His face didn't change. His eyes moved over the numbers, over the name Darcy Wren, over the name Maeve Wren, over the 500,000, over the trust fund, over the house. His father had left everything to a woman who mopped floors and her 5-year-old daughter. For Jude, his father had left a letter. Jude took the envelope. It was light, thin. Inside was only one sheet of paper folded in half. His father's handwriting, shaky, but each word precise like an order, because Walter Thornton, even when his hands couldn't hold a spoon, still wrote like a man giving commands. "You chose the dark. I waited for you to come back. You didn't come back. I found light somewhere else. If you want to see that light, find the Wren woman and her little girl. She isn't afraid of me, like you used to be." Jude finished reading. He read it again, then again. His eyes stopped on the last line. "Like you used to be. Used to be. Before Jude became the boss. Before the dark swallowed him. Before he looked into the mirror and saw a face he didn't recognize as his own. Used to be. Jude at 7 years old, carrying breakfast into his father's room every day. He would climb onto the bed and sit beside his father, not saying anything, just sitting. Walter would snap, "What are you sitting here for?" And Jude would answer, "I want to sit here." And Walter wouldn't chase him away, the only child who wasn't afraid of Walter Thornton, until that child grew up and learned how to make other people afraid of him. Jude folded the letter. He gripped it in his hand, gripped it until the paper wrinkled, until the ink smeared into the still wet blood in his palm. He didn't cry. A boss doesn't cry. But he sat in Penn's office long after Penn had left, sat alone, holding the crushed letter, and breathed. Then he did what his instincts demanded. He investigated. Within 24 hours, Jude's people found out everything about Darcy Wren. Her real name, Darcy Sutter, 27 years old. Married to Troy Sutter, with a record for domestic violence. Darcy had fled 6 months ago, changed her name, took her daughter, moved to a new city. 2 jobs. By day, mopping floors at Crestwood Nursing Home. By night, washing dishes at a diner. No meaningful bank account. No family. No allies. Jude stared at the surveillance photo his people had taken. Darcy stood outside the nursing home gate, thin, exhausted, brown hair tied back in a hurry, her custodial uniform wrinkled. Maeve sat in her arms, head resting on her mother's shoulder, a wax paper bag in her hand. Jude studied the photo for a long time. He was good at reading people, like his father, like the thing both of them had learned from the life they'd chosen. And in that photo, he didn't see a con artist. He didn't see a manipulator. He saw a kind of weariness he recognized, the weariness of someone who'd been fighting too long with no allies, the kind of weariness no amount of money could buy away and no sleep could cure. Jude knew that weariness. He lived with it every day. The rumor about Walter Thornton's will spread faster than Darcy could prepare for. Only 3 days after the meeting in Penn's office, they showed up. Darcy was in the small white house with the blue door Walter had left her, trying to fold her few sets of clothes into the closet, when the doorbell rang. She opened the door and saw 3 people. The woman in front looked around 60, her dark hair streaked with silver, and pulled back so tight the skin at her temples shone, wearing an expensive black dress, perfume so heavy Darcy could smell it before she even caught the woman's face. Behind her stood a young man around 22, tall and thin, with the smug look of someone who had never had to do anything for himself. And at the back was a middle-aged man with a hawk-like face, a pinstriped suit, a leather briefcase in his hand, and a practiced, systematic contempt in his eyes, as if he rehearsed it every morning in the mirror. "Darcy Wren?" the woman said, not asking but confirming, the way police read a name before they put on handcuffs. "I'm Cora Thornton, Walter's sister. This is my son, Mitchell, and this is our attorney, Mr. Graves." Cora didn't wait to be invited. She stepped over the threshold, her gaze sweeping quickly through the small house, over the white painted walls, over the old kitchen table, over Maeve's worn-soled shoes by the door, and on her lips appeared a thin smile, the kind of smile that said every suspicion had just been proven true. "So this is where my brother left you," Cora said. "A house, 500,000, and a trust fund for your daughter. Very impressive, Miss Wren. Very impressive for a woman who mops floors." "I don't understand why you're here," Darcy said. Her voice stayed flat, but her hand had already tightened on the edge of the door. "Oh, I'm here to ask you one very simple question," Cora said, tilting her head, looking Darcy up and down. How much money did it take for you to train that little girl to cry in front of an old man?" Darcy didn't answer. Not because she didn't want to, because she couldn't believe what she'd just heard. "Because I have to say," Cora went on, her voice as gentle as if she were discussing the weather, "it's a lovely story. Poor woman mopping floors, innocent little girl, lonely old man, the cookie. Very moving, very Hollywood. But I live in the real world, Miss Wren, and in the real world, nobody hands over hundreds of millions because of a cookie." "He didn't give me hundreds of millions," Darcy said. "My daughter, your daughter." Mitchell cut in, stepping up beside his mother, his mouth curving. "Right, your daughter. The 5-year-old who just happens to get close to a billionaire. Very convenient, isn't it? We've spoken to counsel, Miss Wren. My grandfather was losing his mind. He was taken advantage of, and we're going to prove it in court." Graves stepped forward, opened his briefcase, and pulled out a packet of papers. He set it down on Darcy's kitchen table without asking, as if this house belonged to him. "We will freeze the assets," Graves said, his voice dry as sandpaper. "We will contest the will on the grounds of incapacity and undue influence. We will investigate every aspect of your life, every dollar you've earned, every place you've lived, every reason you changed your name." Darcy went rigid. Changed her name. They knew she'd changed her name. "And," Mitchell said, leaning in closer to Darcy, lowering his voice, You'll lose custody before the month is out." Those words hit Darcy like a hammer. Lose custody. Not the money. Not the house. Not Troy. Lose Maeve. The biggest fear. The fear every other fear was only a shadow beside. Darcy stood in the middle of her kitchen, one hand gripping the edge of the table, and she felt everything Walter had given her. The house, the money, the safety, being pulled out of her hands piece by piece. She wanted to say something, wanted to throw them out, but her mouth was dry and her legs were shaking, and she could hear Maeve in the next room, singing some song with words she didn't quite know, and Darcy understood that if she said one wrong thing, they would use it against her. Cora gave Darcy one last look, that thin smile, then turned on her heel. Mitchell followed. Graves gathered his papers, left a copy on the kitchen table, and walked out. The blue door closed. Darcy stood there until the sound of their car was gone. Then she slid down onto the kitchen floor, her back against the cabinets, both arms wrapped around her knees. She wanted to call Penn. She wanted to give it all back. The house, the money, the metal box, everything. She only wanted to be left alone. Only wanted to be invisible again. Mama. Maeve stood in the kitchen doorway, holding the eagle coin, staring at her mother on the floor. "Mama, why are you sitting on the ground?" Darcy looked at her child. "Mr. Walt said we can't run anymore," Maeve said, her voice light, like she was reminding her mother of something obvious. Darcy looked into her daughter's green eyes that didn't fear, eyes just like the first day Maeve stood in the doorway of room 214 and asked the crankiest old man in the nursing home if his hand hurt. Outside, across the street from the little house, a black car sat silent beneath the shadow of a tree. Jude Thornton sat behind the wheel, the window half down. He didn't get out. He didn't knock. He only watched. From where he sat, he could see the little girl with brown curls run out into the front yard. She sat on the steps, opened the dark blue metal box set beside her feet, pulled out the eagle coin, and lifted it into the late afternoon sun. The coin glinted. The little girl smiled. Darcy stepped outside and sat beside her daughter, not saying anything, only watching her hold the coin up to the light. Jude watched that scene. He watched the thin woman in a wrinkled custodial uniform sitting beside a 5-year-old on the steps of his father's house. The two of them didn't demand anything, didn't need anything. They only sat, and Jude understood, somewhere deeper than logic, deeper than suspicion. In the place where the 7-year-old boy still sat on his father's bed every morning, that this was what his father had seen. Jude raised the window, started the engine, drove away, but Jude Thornton knew he would come back. The next day, at exactly 4 o'clock in the afternoon, Jude came back. This time he didn't sit in the car. He stepped out, crossed the short street, past the low fence, walked up the steps of the small white house with the blue door, and knocked. 3 knocks. Slow, even, heavy. The kind of knock that comes from a man who isn't used to having to knock. Inside, Darcy was standing at the sink, holding Maeve's plastic cup, and the sound froze her in place. She set the cup down, wiped her hands on her pants, walked to the door, looked through the peephole. The man outside was nearly a head taller than she was. Dark coat, black pants, no suit, but the way he stood, the way he held his hands, the way his shoulders stayed set, carried a kind of authority a suit couldn't add to, and the lack of a suit couldn't take away. But what stopped Darcy wasn't his size. It was his eyes. Gray-blue, sharp, staring straight into the peephole as if he knew she was on the other side. Those eyes. She'd seen those eyes every day for 2 months, on a different face. Older, more lined, but the same color, the same intensity, the same look that pierced right through. Darcy opened the door. She didn't greet him. He didn't greet her. They looked at each other across the threshold, and both of them knew who the other was without introductions. "I'm Jude Thornton," he said. His voice was low and flat, not sharp like Walter's, but carrying the same weight. Walter's son. "I know," Darcy said. She didn't open the door wider. She didn't invite him in. She stood in the doorway with one hand on the doorframe, her body taking up half the opening, and Jude recognized that posture instantly. It wasn't rudeness. It was a mother standing between her child and whatever was outside. She was blocking. "Can I come in?" Jude asked. "Why are you here?" "To understand." One word. Darcy studied him. He held her gaze. The silence stretched long enough for both of them to hear Maeve singing in the other room. Darcy stepped aside. Jude stepped in. He didn't look at Darcy as he passed. He looked at the house. His eyes swept the small living room, the old sofa, the kitchen table with a plastic vase, the refrigerator that, by instinct, by the habits of a man who'd read scenes his whole life, he knew was nearly empty. He looked down at the floor by the door. Maeve's tiny shoes, worn so thin at the soles the rubber was almost paper. Beside them, Darcy's shoes, just as worn, just as thin, telling the same story. Nothing in this house looked like the home of someone who had just inherited hundreds of millions. Everything in this house, said the person living here, was used to having nothing, and didn't yet believe she was allowed to have more. Jude stopped in the kitchen. Darcy stood between him and the hallway that led to Maeve's room, same posture, blocking. "What did you do to my father?" Jude asked. Not sharp, not accusing, but not gentle either. The voice of a man who needed the answer, and would know if the answer was a lie. "My child brought him cookies," Darcy said. "He ate them, that's all. Nobody gives away hundreds of millions for cookies." "Then ask him," Darcy said, and her voice suddenly had an edge. "Oh, right, you can't, because you didn't visit him for 10 years. The words cut. Jude didn't flinch, but his jaw tightened. Darcy saw it, and she didn't take it back. She was used to fear, but ever since Walter looked her in the eye and told her she wasn't allowed to be invisible anymore, something in her had shifted. She didn't want to fight, but she wouldn't bow. Not in the house Walter had left her. The singing in the next room stopped. Then came the sound of tiny feet running on the wood floor. Maeve appeared in the kitchen doorway, curls messy, a smear of flour still on her mouth from the cookie she'd been eating. She saw Jude. She stopped. She looked at him and tilted her head, the way Darcy had seen her do it the very first day in the doorway of room 214. Then Maeve's green eyes went wide. "Your eyes look like Mr. Waltz." Jude went still. The child wasn't afraid of him. The way she hadn't been afraid of Walter. The way, 29 years earlier, a boy named Jude had looked at his father. "Do you want a cookie?" Maeve asked. "My mom just baked them. Oatmeal. Raisins. A little dry but good." She didn't wait for an answer. She ran into the kitchen, opened the tin on the counter, took out a cookie, and placed it in Jude's hand. A tiny hand set the cookie into a large palm. Jude stared at it. Round, brown, oat crumbs, raisins, like every oatmeal raisin cookie in the world. But he held it, and something in him cracked open. Somewhere deep. Somewhere he'd built walls around for 10 years. Because his mother used to bake these, before she died, before everything fell apart. The smell of oats and raisins. The smell of the old kitchen. The smell of before. Jude took a bite. Dry, crisp, chewy raisins. Exactly the same. "My father," Jude said, his voice rougher than he meant it to be. "What kind did he like?" Darcy looked at him. She saw something change in his face as he bit into the cookie. Something she'd seen once before on a different face. Older, the first time Maeve had held a cookie up to Walter's mouth. "He said he hated oatmeal raisin," Darcy said quietly. "Said he only liked chocolate. But he was lying. He ate every one, every day, down to the last crumb." Jude lowered his head. The cookie in his hand was half-eaten. His shoulders shook, slightly, almost invisible. But Darcy saw it, and Maeve saw it. Maeve stepped forward. She didn't ask if he was okay. She didn't say anything at all. She simply laid her tiny hand over Jude Thornton's large hand, the hand still bearing the cut from the shattered glass the night he learned his father was gone, and she held it there, steady, the way she once held an oatmeal raisin cookie for the old man in room 214. The deposition room was on the 12th floor of the law building. White lights, a long glossy table, leather chairs, a recorder, and a stenographer in the corner typing every word. Everything in that room was designed to make the person across from you feel small, and Darcy felt small. She sat at one end of the table with pen beside her. At the other end, Graves settled into his seat like a hawk, landing on a branch, comfortable, patient, ready. Behind Graves, along the wall, Cora sat with her legs crossed, face cold. Mitchell sat beside his mother, arms folded, his mouth curved upward. "Miss Wren," Graves began, his voice sweet and slow. The kind of sweet that pours honey into your ear before it cuts your throat. "Thank you for coming. I only have a few simple questions." Darcy nodded. Her hands were clenched beneath the table, clenched so hard her knuckles turned white. "How long have you worked at Crestwood Nursing Home?" 6 months. "What is your salary?" "Minimum wage." "Do you have debt?" "Yes." "How much?" Darcy swallowed. "A lot." "And your daughter Maeve, you hid her in the nursing home's cleaning supply closet because you couldn't afford childcare, correct?" "Correct. So you're in debt. You're fleeing a husband. You changed your name. You hid your child among chemical supplies. And then your daughter just happens to become close to the wealthiest patient in the facility." Graves leaned forward. "You want the court to believe that was coincidence?" Darcy opened her mouth, but no words came. She saw Cora smiling against the wall. She saw Mitchell nodding along. She saw the stenographer's fingers moving, capturing everything. And she felt everything tighten. The room tightening, the air tightening, the same feeling as nights when Troy stood in the middle of the room and she shrank into the corner, waiting for the storm to pass. "Did you instruct your daughter to approach the patient in room 214? Graves asked. "No, I forbade her. But she went anyway." "Yes. And you couldn't stop her." "I did try. My daughter. Your daughter doesn't listen." "Or your daughter was instructed not to listen?" Graves tilted his head. "Those are two different things, Miss Wren." Darcy stared down at the table. Her hands shook beneath the glossy wood. She thought about standing up, apologizing, giving everything back, saying she didn't want any of it, saying she only wanted to go home and hold her child and disappear, invisible, safe. Then she heard it, not with her ears, with something deeper. Walter's voice in the dark of room 214. "You're afraid of everything." And Maeve's voice on the kitchen floor. "Mr. Walt said we can't run anymore." Darcy lifted her head. She looked at Graves. Her hands still trembled, but her eyes didn't. "You want to know what I taught my child?" Darcy said. Her voice was small, but each word was clear, like she was walking a wire and looking straight ahead instead of down. "I taught my child to be invisible. I taught her to be quiet. I taught her not to go out, not to make noise, not to talk to anyone. 3 rules. Every day. Because I was afraid. Afraid of losing my job. Afraid my ex-husband would find us. Afraid someone would take my child. I taught my child how to become nobody." The room went still. The typing stopped. "But my 5-year-old didn't listen," Darcy continued, and she walked into the room of an old man no one in that building dared to enter. She looked at him and asked if his hand hurt. "I didn't teach her that. She did that on her own, because she saw someone in pain that no one else would even look at." Graves opened his mouth, but Darcy didn't stop. "And you ask me if I want to give it back. I do. I want to give it all back and disappear because I'm afraid. But Walter Thornton looked me in the eye and told me I wasn't allowed to be invisible anymore. He wrote that into his will. He wrote it with hands that couldn't even hold a spoon. If I give it back, I betray him, and I won't betray the only person in my life who ever truly saw me." No one spoke. Graves leaned back in his chair. His hand rested on the table, fingers tapping lightly, but his eyes had lost their rhythm. Cora wasn't smiling anymore. Mitchell glanced at his mother, and for the first time, the smugness on his face wavered. Penn sat beside Darcy, silent, but he gave a small nod, a nod to himself, the kind of nod from a man who has just seen something he hoped for but didn't dare count on. "Let's move to the next portion," Graves said, his voice flatter now, more controlled, less sweet. The recorded interview with Maeve. The screen at the head of the table turned on. Maeve sat in a chair too big for her, feet not touching the floor, arms wrapped around a stuffed bear Penn had bought for her before the recording. The interviewer asked gently, "Do you visit Mr. Walt often?" "Yes, every day." "Did he promise you anything?" "No. He gave me a coin. He said it was junk." "What did he call you?" Maeve smiled, her gap-toothed grin. "He said I was the quartermaster, the one who gives cookies to soldiers. He said he was my soldier." The deposition room fell silent. The stenographer stopped typing. On the screen, Maeve hugged her bear, feet swinging, talking about the cranky old man in room 214 in the voice of a 5-year-old who didn't even know what calculation was. Then Mitchell spoke. Along the wall, Mitchell leaned toward his mother, voice low but still audible, deliberately audible. "Kid's a good actress. Bet her mom trained her real well." The room froze. Penn's pen tightened in his hand. Darcy went rigid. And in the back row, where no one had invited him, where he had come in and sat down without asking permission, Jude Thornton heard every word. His eyes, gray-blue like his father's, went dark. Penn let Mitchell's remark hang in the air long enough for everyone in the room to hear it clearly, to hear it fully, and to remember it. Then he stood. He didn't look at Mitchell. He didn't look at Cora. He looked at Graves. "Mr. Graves," Penn said, his voice flat as a lake before a storm, "before you continue insulting a 5-year-old child in my deposition room, I'd like to introduce one final piece of evidence." Graves frowned. "What evidence? We weren't notified of any." "Walter notified me," Penn cut in, 2 years ago. He opened his leather briefcase, pulled out a small silver recording device, and set it on the table. "My client was a careful man. He spent his entire life preparing for every situation. He knew the will would be contested. He knew the family would claim he'd lost his mind. He knew, because he knew you." Penn pressed a button. The screen at the head of the table switched from Maeve's interview to a new image. Room 214. Green walls, a bed with a hard pillow, and on the bed, Walter Thornton sat propped up, a hospital gown thin as paper, silver hair sticking up, face lean, but his gray-blue eyes piercing as a freshly honed blade. He stared straight into the camera. "My name is Walter Thornton," he said, that familiar gravelly growl, the voice Crestwood nurses heard every day and Darcy heard every afternoon and Maeve heard every time her cookie got criticized. "Today is October 28th. I am lucid. I know who I am. I know where my money is, and I know exactly what I am doing." He coughed, a rasping cough. The cough Darcy recognized instantly, the cough she heard every time she stepped into room 214. Then he lifted his head, looked into the camera, and his voice shifted from cranky to ice cold. "Cora, if you're watching this, it means I'm dead and you're suing. Of course you're suing. You've only ever known how to take. Your whole life, you've only known how to take." Along the wall, Cora's face began to drain white. Mitchell's mouth fell open. "You and your boy," Walter continued on the screen, 10 years without visiting me. Not one call, not one letter. I've been in this place 2 years. 2 years, Cora. My hands swelled up so bad I couldn't hold a spoon. I ate alone every day. And you didn't even know if I was alive or dead." He paused, drew a breath. His eyes stayed on the camera, but his voice grew heavier, tired, like a man speaking something he'd carried for too long. "You didn't come because I didn't have money anymore. I took it all out. I disappeared. And you disappeared right along with it. That's all I needed to know." Then Walter looked to his right, off camera, out of frame, and his face changed, not slightly, completely. The lines on his forehead eased, his jaw stopped grinding. Those gray-blue eyes, the eyes the whole nursing home said could freeze blood, softened. He was looking at someone the camera couldn't capture, but everyone in the deposition room knew exactly who it was. "No," he said, his voice rough but gentle enough that Darcy at this end of the table broke into tears she couldn't hold back. "I'm not a chocolate man." I lied. He smiled, a real smile. The smile 2 years of Crestwood nurses had never seen, the smile Darcy had only glimpsed once, when Maeve told the story about the flying fish. "Oatmeal's good, quartermaster." Then he turned back to the camera. The smile vanished. His face hardened. His gaze steeled once more. Walter Thornton, 71 years old, stared straight into the lens, stared straight at Cora, at Mitchell, at Graves, at anyone who dared challenge his final will. "My money, my will. I give it to whoever I want. You want to sue? Then sue. I'll be waiting." The screen went dark. The deposition room sank into silence. The recorder still ran. The stenographer had forgotten to type. Graves sat there, face gone pale, hands on the table, fingers no longer tapping. His entire case, every argument about incompetence, manipulation, the floor mopper tricking an old man, had just been shattered by the old man himself from his hospital bed, with eyes like steel and a smile meant for a 5-year-old child. Cora stood. Her face was paper white, lips pressed tight, and she didn't speak. She walked out of the room. Mitchell rose after her, the smugness gone, replaced by something that looked like fear. In the back row, Jude sat motionless. He had watched the entire video. He had seen his father scold Cora with a voice he remembered from childhood. He had seen his father's face soften when he turned toward someone off camera, and he had seen his father smile. For the first time in 10 years, Jude Thornton had seen his father smile. That smile wasn't for him. That smile was for the 5-year-old who brought oatmeal raisin cookies every day at 4 o'clock, and that hurt more than anything Jude had ever carried. Graves packed up his briefcase, slowly, in silence. He stood, buttoned his suit jacket, and looked at Penn. "We can open negotiations." Penn didn't stand. He stayed seated, both hands on the table, looking at Graves with the calm eyes of a man who had known this ending for 2 years. "No," Penn said. "No negotiation. Walter wanted you to receive exactly what he left you." Graves waited. Nothing. After the deposition, Jude didn't go back to the penthouse. He drove through the city, past the streets he controlled, past the buildings he owned, past the corners where people lowered their heads when his car passed, and he didn't see any of it. He saw only his father's face on that screen, the smile meant for a 5-year-old child, the smile not meant for him. He drove to the small white house with the blue door. The 3rd time. The first time he'd sat in the car and watched. The 2nd time he'd knocked and bitten into the cookie. This time, when Darcy opened the door, she didn't ask what he was here for. She looked at his face and understood, the kind of understanding that comes from having seen that face in the mirror too many times. The face of someone who needs to be close to another human being and doesn't know how to ask. She stepped aside. Jude walked in. He sat at the kitchen table. Darcy made coffee without asking how he took it. She remembered. Last time he'd drunk it black, no sugar. Maeve ran out of her room, saw Jude, her face lighting up, climbed onto the chair beside him, and dragged the dark blue metal box from wherever she'd hidden it, setting it in the middle of the table. No one spoke. Jude looked at the box. He laid his hand on the lid, his fingers touching the chipped dark blue paint, touching the rusted metal latch. Then he opened it. He passed over the coin, passed over the keepsakes. He took the cheap spiral notebook, the nursing home journal. He opened to the first page. His father's handwriting. Shaky, but sharp. The writing of a man whose hands had betrayed him but whose mind still commanded. August 14th. This new place is as bad as I wanted it to be. Green gelatin is a crime against humanity. Green walls. I hate green. No one visits. Good. Jude turned the page. August 15th. Still no one. Jude doesn't call. Of course. I don't call either. 2 stubborn bastards. Jude stopped on that line. 2 stubborn bastards. He read it again. Then he turned the page. Hundreds of pages. A few lines each day. Sometimes longer. But the theme didn't change. No one. No one. No one visits. Nurses play rock, paper, scissors. The doctor comes and goes like a thief. Green gelatin. Green walls. Alone. Jude read through the summer. Through the first fall. Through winter. Through spring. Through the second summer. No one. No one. No one. Then the handwriting shifted. October 12th. The ghost showed up. Curly-haired kid. Stared at me. I yelled. She didn't run. Strange. Jude stopped flipping. He read more slowly. October 13th. The ghost came back. Left a cookie. Oatmeal raisin. Dry as sawdust. But it's been a long time since anyone gave me anything. October 14th. She caught me awake. I called her the cookie ghost. She isn't scared. She said her mother baked it. Cookies still dry, but I ate it all. Jude turned the page. With every page, his father's voice changed. Not in a dramatic way, in the way ice melts. Slow, 1 drop at a time. Green gelatin still got cursed. Green walls still got hated. But between the grumbling lines, other lines began to appear. The kid asked how high I can count. I told her I can count money. She said counting money doesn't count. Her mother brought hot soup. Didn't say anything. Just set it on the table and left. First time in 2 years I ate something hot. Stray cat outside the window. The kid named it Stripes. Dumb name. But the cat seems to like it. Then Jude reached the page he wasn't ready for. No one would have been ready for that page. November 20th. The kid held the cookie for me today. My hands are useless. Shaking. Couldn't hold a cookie the size of my finger. She didn't say anything. No pity. Just picked it up, held it in front of me, and waited. Like Jude when he was little. Jude stopped reading. The boy used to bring breakfast into my room. Climb onto the bed, sit beside me, didn't say a word, just sat. I yelled at him to get out. He didn't. He said he wanted to sit there, and I didn't make him leave. Before I ruined everything, Jude closed the notebook. He closed it with both hands, like shutting the lid of a coffin. Then he sat there with both hands on top of it, head bowed, and his shoulders shook. Not a slight tremor, real shaking. His whole body. A 36-year-old boss, the man who walked into rooms and people stood, the man no one dared stare at too long, sitting at a small kitchen table in his father's white house with the blue door, and crying, for the first time in 10 years. Silent crying, mouth shut, shoulders shaking, tears falling onto the back of the hand that still carried the scar from the shattered glass the night he learned his father was gone. Like Darcy in the nursing home bathroom. Like Walter in the dark of room 214 when he said, "My wife used to say that too." The kind of crying that belongs to someone who has forgotten how to cry, and the body has to remember for him. Darcy stood at the sink with her back turned. She heard it. She didn't turn around, because she understood there are moments when a person needs to cry without being watched. But she cried too. Cried because for the first time she was seeing a powerful man allow himself to be weak. Maeve sat beside Jude. She watched him cry. She laid her small hand on his arm. "Mister." Walt cried too, Maeve said softly, like she was sharing a secret. "He thought I didn't see, but I did." Jude lifted his head. His eyes were red. He looked at the little girl. She looked back with green eyes that didn't fear, didn't judge, just stayed there. The way she had stayed there for Walter. "My father," Jude said, his voice rough and heavy, each word having to be pulled up out of his throat. "Did my father hurt? At the end?" Darcy turned around. She looked at Jude. She remembered that morning, Ray standing outside room 214 with his head bowed. She remembered what the night nurse had written in the log. "No," Darcy said. "The nurse said he was asleep." For the first time in 2 years, his face wasn't tight. Jude closed his eyes. He nodded once. A slow, weighted nod. The nod of a man who has just received the only thing he needed to hear. And that was enough. 6 months later, Darcy Wren's world no longer resembled anything she had ever known. Troy Sutter became a name in court records, not a ghost in the night anymore. Penn had prepared everything while Walter was still alive. The restraining order, the domestic violence file compiled and organized, a dedicated attorney retained, a legal protection system activated by a midnight phone call from a nursing home bed. Walter Thornton, the old man who couldn't hold a spoon, had built a fortress around Darcy and her child before he left this world. Not with his old power, with law, with paperwork, with the careful precision of a man who had lived long enough to know war isn't always won with strength. Troy vanished from Darcy's life. This time it was permanent. Not because Jude threatened him, not because someone hit him, but because for the first time in her life, Darcy had a system behind her. She didn't need a savior. She needed tools to protect herself. Walter gave her that. And Jude Thornton kept coming back to the small white house with the blue door. Many times. The first time, because of the journal, he read a few pages at a time, slowly, as if he feared that if he finished it, he would lose his father all over again. Every page carried his father's voice, bitter, cranky, then little by little, warming line by line from the day the cookie ghost appeared. The second time, because Maeve invited him to eat cookies, she baked with her mother, misshapen cookies with burnt edges, raisins clumped on one side, and Maeve handed one to Jude with flour stuck to both hands, wearing the proudest expression a 5-year-old can have. Jude ate the whole thing. He didn't complain. The third time, because Darcy made coffee without asking. Black, no sugar, she remembered. And Jude realized it had been a long time since anyone remembered what he liked. The fourth time, the fifth, the sixth. He didn't need a reason anymore. He came because the penthouse was vast and dark and cold, and no one there held a cookie and waited for him. He came because at the small kitchen table in his father's house, there was a child telling stories about flying fish. There was a woman making coffee without asking, and there was a journal where every page he turned gave him one more day sitting beside his father even though his father was gone. One afternoon, Maeve baked with Darcy in the kitchen. Jude sat at the table reading the journal, and Maeve ran over with flour all over her hands and smeared a white streak across his nose. He looked at her, not even reacting in time. "Now you look like Mr. Walt," Maeve said, grinning. Jude smiled. Not the smile he used in boardrooms. Not the smile he used to make people comfortable before delivering decisions they didn't want to hear. A real smile. And that smile looked like his father's. Darcy stood at the sink, saw it, and turned away because her eyes burned. That night, after Maeve was asleep, Darcy sat on the small front porch. Jude sat beside her. No touching, no talking, just sitting. The way Maeve sat beside Walter. The way 7-year-old Jude sat beside his father. Simply being there. "I'm not ready," Darcy said, eyes on the dark street. She didn't explain what she wasn't ready for. She didn't have to. "I know," Jude said. He didn't leave. 6 months after Walter was gone, Crestwood Nursing Home opened a new wing. They didn't call it the Thornton Wing. They called it the Thornton Wren Wing. The walls were painted a warm yellow. Green gelatin was removed from the menu permanently. The nurses got raises. The second-floor supply closet was turned into a children's reading room, and in the corner there was an overturned bucket painted pink, with Maeve's messy handwriting above it that said, "Maeve's seat." Darcy stood at the podium. She wore a simple blue dress. She hadn't written anything down. She looked at the faces below, looked at Ray smiling, looked at Brenda standing with her arms crossed but eyes wet, looked at Penn standing straight as a post, looked at Jude in the back row, not needing to stand in the front. "I used to mop floors here," Darcy said, her voice quiet but steady. "My job was to be invisible. A cranky old man in room 214 saw me. He saw my daughter. He taught us that kindness isn't weakness. This new wing isn't because of money. It's because of a cookie." Room 214 was no longer a patient room. It was a small library, full of soft chairs and books. Walter's dark blue metal box sat in the corner, displayed there forever. Maeve sat on the floor reading out loud from the journal to Ray, her 5.5-year-old voice mispronouncing half the words and no one correcting her. December 23rd. The quartermaster brought chocolate chip cookies. Christmas present. I ate 3. My stomach will kill me before the illness does. But it was good. Ray laughed. He was picky, wasn't he? He was picky, Maeve laughed. But he was my Mr. Walt. Darcy stood beside the metal box. She touched the lid and opened a small lower compartment she had never opened before. Inside was a neatly folded wax paper bag. She pulled it out. The bag was weightless, thin, old, its creases softened by time. The very first wax paper bag Maeve had used for the very first cookie, the cookie she had set on Walter's bedside table, and then run away. He had kept it, folded carefully, stored with the most important things in his life. Inside the bag, there were still crumbs. Darcy held the bag in her hands. Her hands shook, her eyes burned, and this time, she didn't go to a bathroom. She didn't lock a door. She didn't clamp her mouth shut. She cried in the room, in front of Ray, in front of Maeve, in front of everyone. For the first time in her life, Darcy Wren allowed herself to be seen in her pain. On the wall, directly above the metal box, there was a small brass plaque, in memory of Walter Walt Thornton. His hands hurt, but his heart didn't. Jude stood in the doorway. Darcy turned, tears still on her face. Their shoulders touched, light, natural, as if that place had always existed and had simply been waiting for them to step into it. Maeve looked up from the journal. "Mama, who do I bake cookies for tomorrow?" Darcy looked at Jude. Jude looked at Darcy. The boss smiled, a smile like Walter's. "Bake a lot. There are plenty of hungry people around here." And that is the story of Darcy, Maeve, and the cranky old man in room 214. A story that began with an oatmeal raisin cookie, dry as sawdust according to him, and ended with something no money can buy, no power can force, and no will can fully put into words, that sometimes the most precious thing you can give someone isn't $1 million or a house. It's seeing them, truly seeing them, while the whole world walks past. If this story touched some corner of your heart, if you've ever been invisible, or you've ever known someone lonely that no one seemed to notice, please hit like and share this video so the story can reach more people. Please subscribe to our channel so each day you can hear more stories that reach the heart. We'd truly love to know how you felt after this story. Which part made you cry? Have you ever met someone like Walter, or someone like Darcy, in your own life? Leave a comment and share what's in your heart. We read every line, and we value every word. Thank you for being here, for listening, for walking with us from a chemical-filled supply closet to a small white house with a blue door. Wishing you and the people you love good health, joy, and peace each day. Goodbye, and we'll see you again in the next story.